Hi, I'm Eric Ostro. Live at the Lortel is about to start. For Season 2, While Theaters Are Dark, we are discussing with our guests their thoughts on the reckoning the theater community is facing for systemic racism and their vision for the future of the American theater. To broaden our perspective, I am sharing my platform with co-hosts from the BIPOC community. We offer these conversations to help us learn and to start the healing process. Hi, good evening, everybody. Excuse me. My name is Eric Ostro, host of Live at the Lortel. Before we start the show, I want to introduce my colleague, Viet Vo, who is going to talk about how the Lucille Lortel Theater is uplifting AAPI companies and their programs through its social media platform for AAPI Heritage Month. Welcome, Viet.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Eric. How are you today?
How are you doing? It's good to see you.
Good to see you, too. As Eric has mentioned, I'm here working with the Lucille Lortel Foundation. And May is AAPI Heritage Month. And all month, we'll be uplifting AAPI companies and programs through our social media platforms. So you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. For Instagram, it's at Lortel Theater. I also want to invite you to Fridays at 7 p.m. for this whole month, as I'm going to be doing an Instagram live chat with individuals from our API community. And this Friday, we have a special guest. It is Francis Ju.
One of my favorites. Yeah, the best.
I'm looking forward to it, but I'm also a little nervous about it. But hopefully, I'll be all there.
There's nobody kinder and sweeter than that man, Francis Ju. He's amazing.
As I've heard and seen of his work.
Yeah, you'll know it.
And other upcoming events include, for this month, Mayi Theater is presenting a puppet play called Vancouver, created with the Chicago International Puppet Theater Festival. It's a story that tells about an Asian American family dealing with anti-Asian aggression. Along with that, they're also doing a reading of Once Upon a Korean Time by Daniel K. Isaacs. Tickets and more information can be found at mayitheater.org. That's ma-yetheater.org. Along with that, Pan Asian Repertory Theater will be presenting some special events. On May 14th, they're presenting an Ibsen Training Lab Zoom read. And then on May 30th at 6 p.m., they are also presenting a memorial Zoom tribute to a legend, Corky Lee. For those of you who know who Corky Lee is, legend in our community with his eye and his genius when it came to photography and capturing moments in our AAPI history and heritage. Along with that, May 17th to the 30th, they'll be extending The Emperor's Nightingale with a re-envisioned virtual and with interactive educational calligraphy. So that should be fun. And you can find more information and ticket information at www.panasian.org.
Oh, Viet, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing it. Thank you for being such a big part of it and lifting up the AAPI Heritage Month. And we're very excited for it. And we're very excited that you're heading it up. So thank you. Thank you for coming on tonight and sharing that with everybody. And you can find all this information at the Lortel website. And thank you again.
Thank you. Have a great night, folks.
Have a good night. So let's get right to our show. Let me bring on our co-host, my dear friend, John Andrew. John, hey, that was quick. Wow, you were here quick.
I know. I did make an entrance today. I'll flash my head.
Flip of the hair. Okay. All right, we don't want to run out of time. Let's get right to our guest. David Henry Hwang is an American playwright, librettist, screenwriter, theater professor at Columbia University in New York City. He has won 3 Obie Awards, a Tony Award. 3 of his works, and Butterfly, Yellowface, Soft Power, have been finalists for the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Without further ado, let's welcome our guest, David Henry Hwang. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We're so honored to have you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's really cool to meet you and get to chat with you. You've worked and met all of the coolest people, and you're one of the coolest people yourself. And so I'm probably going to just want to ask you all about that.
Okay, I think this interview is getting off to a great start already.
It sure is. You know what, John Andrew, this afternoon forwarded me an article that you wrote for the Times about a time where you were stabbed in the neck. Just out of nowhere, you were on your way back from the grocery store, on your way back from a trip, and somebody came up from behind you and stabbed you right in the neck. And luckily, thanks to the help of great surgeons, they patched you up. But I mean, I think that could take us into a conversation about what the hell is happening in our country now, and where is it coming from, and how can we stop this? What the hell is going on? I'm not asking you that question, but I would love for you to talk about your experience and what's happening in the world now.
Sure. So lately I've come to sometimes call myself an OG AAPI attack survivor, because this happened to me a few years ago. And yes, I was walking my block just around 9 p.m., gotten some groceries, and I felt like somebody hit me on the back of my head hard. So I turned, I saw a shadowy figure running away. I said, what the F? And but I figured I wasn't going to chase after him. So I was headed back home, but then I couldn't walk straight. I veered first into a parked car, then into a wall, and I put my hand up to where I'd been hit, and it came away covered with blood. At that point, I realized I'd been stabbed. I remembered from Boy Scouts, because I was a Boy Scout, that you're supposed to put pressure on a wound, and I did that, and I found I could walk straight. Stopping home, I live around 2 blocks away from Brooklyn Hospital. My wife and daughter caught up with me. We got there, and I said, I'm going to faint now. And I did. And it turned out that my attacker had severed my vertebral artery, and I'd lost about a third of my blood. But I was really fortunate. I mean, that I was in the hospital for like 3 days, and that weekend I went to a performance of the musical Allegiance, which you may recall was on Broadway a few years ago with Lea Salonga and Telly Leung and George Takei. And and the NYPD did not label my attack a hate crime, although they said it would be an attempted murder charge. But now we kind of know, particularly post the Georgia massacre, that the cops never want to call anything a hate crime. And at that time, Assemblyman Ron Kim from Queens called a press conference to denounce anti-Asian hate. So, this is not new, of course. There's a long history of racism and discrimination and attacks and hate and lynchings and all sorts of things against Asian Americans in this country's history. But this past year, it has certainly been exacerbated by our former president using terms like China virus and Kung flu. And I think those of us who are Asian, although the events have been more elevated now, we've been feeling pretty vulnerable for the last year.
Yeah, that the rhetoric it has been terrible. I'm wondering, did they ever find the guy? I know in the article they said that.
No, they never did. I mean, I have to say, I don't know that. In my experience, the NYPD did not do a very good job of trying to solve my crime. They told me, the detectives told me, we are under some pressure to solve this because you're high profile. But even then, like, I would call and the detective would be out. And then a few months later, my sister called and was told, well, we didn't find anyone, so we closed the case.
Wow.
So in my view, I agree with those who say more policing is not the answer.
Yeah, and they didn't even alert you to the fact that they closed the case.
No.
Like,
I thought if they didn't catch someone, the case is open.
That's what you would think.
That's what happens on TV.
Well, correct. Wow. So it's terrifying time for so many people. I mean, you can't watch the news or pick up a paper without somebody being attacked and somebody being just pushed down on the subway. Or, I mean, it's just he's created this free for all to do whatever and whenever, and it's terrifying.
Yeah, and I think that Asian Americans, API, suffer from a couple of stereotypes that, in combination, are pretty debilitating to our community and to BIPOC people in general. One is the perpetual foreigner stereotype. So, you couldn't have been born in this country. I mean, Asian Americans have been in this country since the middle of the 19th century. Your forebears may have come several generations ago, and people still go, oh, you speak really good English, which is, so there are those microaggressions. But then where they become major attacks and threats are at moments like this, when all of a sudden this country has some sort of conflict with some Asian country, and Asian Americans always get caught in the crossfire because we are not considered to be actually Americans. So there's that. And then there's the model minority stereotype,
right?
Which is used by the right wing to separate AAPIs from our natural allies, who are, Black people, Latinx people, Indigenous people, people who know the history of racism in this country. And the whole Asian American movement really was an outgrowth of Black power in the 1960s. So we share so much. And when I was, a kid and in college in the 70s, we had what we called third world solidarity. And I think that's important, and that's been lost because of this model minority stereotype.
Yeah,
I agree. Let's talk a little bit about Stanford, where you founded the Asian American Theater Project, right? AATP, and produced your first play that you wrote in your dorm. What was your time at Stanford like? What did it? How did it inspire you and make you a playwright?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up really going to theater. I was born in LA. My parents are immigrants. But when I was 10, my father was he was an accountant. So he was the bookkeeper. He volunteered to be the bookkeeper for a new theater company that had been founded in Los Angeles, called East West Players. And it ended up being the first, still exists today, going strong, first AAPI theater. And at this point, the oldest long-running BIPOC theater in America, I believe. So my mom became the rehearsal pianist for a production they were doing of Minotti's operetta, The Medium, directed by the great director Mako. And I had the choice at 10 of either going to rehearsals or being babysat at my aunt's, and I decided to go to rehearsals. So I don't actually remember that much about the show, but by the time I got to college and I saw some plays my freshman year, and the idea popped into my head that, oh, maybe I can do this. I think maybe it's significant that as a kid, I saw people who look like me being actors, being directors, being artistic leaders, and that maybe made it more possible for me to envision trying to do this myself. So I started writing some plays in my spare time. I found a professor. Stanford at the time didn't have any playwriting classes. So I found a professor who was head of the creative writing department, a novelist, but taught a class in contemporary drama. And I asked him to look at some of my plays. And he told me they were really bad, which they were. And my problem was that I wanted to write plays, but I didn't actually know anything about the theater. But this same professor was a good guy and helped me invent a playwriting major, design a playwriting major within the creative writing program. And I basically saw as many plays and read as many plays as I could for the next few years. And that was my education.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Wow.
And then you had Sam Shepard and Maria Irene Fornes as teachers. I mean, talk about being the coolest person and getting to work with cool people. Like, what was it like having Maria Irene Fornes as a teacher?
Yeah, so that was the summer before my senior year in college. And I was home in LA. I saw an ad in the paper that said, study playwriting with Sam Shepard. And I was like, wow, because Sam was one of the people whose work really excited me when I first started reading. So I clipped this thing and I sent it in. And it was the first year of what eventually became a pretty prominent event in Southern California theater called the Padua Hills Playwrights Festival. But this was only the first year that they ever tried to do it. So there were only 2 of us that applied to be students. So we both got in. And that's where I got to meet Sam and Irene and some other great playwrights, Walter Hadler, Murray Mednick, and they taught us to write more from our subconscious. And prior to that point, I knew I wanted to be a playwright, but I didn't really have much of a sense of myself as an Asian American. And yet when I started writing and doing these exercises, I found these issues starting to appear on the page and stories about immigration or assimilation, racism. So clearly some part of me was incredibly interested in these issues, but my conscious mind hadn't figured that out yet. And so I discovered myself as an Asian American through the playwriting.
Wow. So pretty much the plays that you were writing before.
They were like, I was trying to do imitation Tom Stoppard, meditations on the existence of God, that kind of thing.
So it wasn't, you weren't really, the subjects that you were doing were just, you were trying to copy from something else.
Yeah.
Wow.
Do you still have them? Have you ever looked back at any of them? And
I'd love to see some of those.
I cleared out my, my mom passed away a couple of years ago, and I cleared out her, or my sisters and I cleared out her place. And I think I found those old plays, but I haven't had the guts to look at them yet.
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
Well, maybe this interview will inspire you to go.
I could just go look right now, and we can
bring them back. Go ahead.
And Joe Papp. I mean, like, this is what I'm saying. You're the coolest guy. Like, like, what was that like? Being mentored and kind of like championed by Joseph Papp. That's incredible.
So I think that it's very strange, and wonderful and strange that I wrote this play to be done in my dorm, FOB, and then 14 months later, it opened at the public when Joe was still running it. But it's also a story about the importance of community activism, because about the time that I was doing the play in my dorm, the public produced a show in which a Caucasian actor played an Asian role. And this led to the Asian actors of that day. We're talking about 1978. There weren't too many of them. They didn't have any power, but they took the initiative to picket in front of the public theater and protest yellow-face casting. It was probably the first yellow-face protest in New York theater history. And Joe, being who Joe was and being dedicated to creating a theater which looked like New York, Joe ended up inviting them into his office and hiring one of them onto his staff with a brief to find plays for Asian actors. And it was just about that time that my play that I'd written for my dorm came across their desks. So I'm the beneficiary of affirmative action, right? Because that's what affirmative action does. Yeah. It recognizes a social need and then creates a program to try to address that. Now, in this case, the whole thing was created by Joe, but it's always stood out to me as an example of the interface between community activism and art.
I mean, and you did several plays with Joe Papp, right? So talk about the experience of like working with him and like getting to be there with him, and that's so cool that he was able to listen and take an action, right? Like get out of his own way.
Yeah, I mean, Joe was amazing and obviously brilliant and politically committed and complicated. You'll hear lots of stories about Joe Papp, most of which are kind of wonderful and some of which are difficult. And I feel he produced my first 4 plays at the Public when I was in my early 20s, and it was really a kind of surrogate father relationship. And I think most playwrights who came through the Public Theater, particularly, those who were young men, which I was at the time, will describe Joe as having been a surrogate father. And therefore, there's the warmth, there's the investment, there's the commitment. And then there's also, at a certain point, he almost always got a little bit tired of you and moved on to the next surrogate child. So I kind of think of him as a serial surrogate father. But when I was, who gets to do that? I mean, who gets to have an experience of having your work produced at the Public Theater, having that essentially be your education in your early 20s? I was incredibly blessed, and it's just I feel like I have a lot to pay forward.
I love this. I love the story that you tell about that. Was it Joe that handed you the play and he said rewrite it, and you put it in your drawer, and you tell the story.
Yeah. So yes, I did. I went into after Joe came across my play, we did a reading at the Public for him, and then he said, he took me into his office, and he was Joe Papp, and I was 21, 22 years old. And of course, I really wanted him to like me. And he said, I like this play, but I have some notes. And he gave me his notes, and I didn't actually agree with them, although I knew enough not to say I disagree with you. But he said, okay, so do a rewrite and, send me the new draft, and I'll decide if I'm going to do the play. So I went back to San Francisco. I waited about 3 weeks, and then I sent him back the exact same script. And 10 days later, the phone rings, and it's Joe Papp, and he's like, the play's great now, we're going to do it. So that's the other part of the story about how I got my first production.
I have some audience questions and a shout out from Jonathan Chan.
Hey,
a shout out from Australia, from the cast of Yellowface, sending DHH love from down under.
Thank you. They just closed that production, I think, 2 nights ago.
Wow.
And apparently did really well. So congratulations, you folks. Thank you for doing the show.
Thank you for watching. I have a question from the audience, and please ask questions. From Grace Hwang. I didn't know you went to Allegiance that weekend. Yowza. Was the accountant for EWP. Why don't I know all this? Wow.
Is that Grace Hwang? By the way, it's Huang, yes. Not Hwang. Is that Grace Hwang, my sister?
I think so, yes.
Oh, well, we can talk about that offline.
That is amazing. So, Tony Award for M. Butterfly. Mm-hmm. Okay. How do you get to Broadway?
You have to have a producer who's willing to roll a big dice and take a big gamble. And, I've been fortunate to have a few of those. Joe was, of course, a great producer. Stuart Ostro produced M. Butterfly on Broadway. And we initially met to talk about another project. But I had come across the story of a true story about, for those of you who don't know the story of M. Butterfly, it's about a French diplomat who had a 20-year affair with a Chinese actress who turned out to be A, a spy, and B, physically male. And the diplomat claimed that he never knew the gender of his lover. So I heard that story and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And my initial thought was that it would be a musical, that it would be kind of a riff on Madame Butterfly, which M. Butterfly is, but also that it would recognize the source by having music in it. And Stewart at that point was mostly known as a producer of musicals. It's probably most famous for having produced the original Pippin and 1776. So I said, Stewart, I have this idea for a musical. And he supported me with some funding for research and stuff like that, because in those days that was pre-internet. So it's not like I could find out what was going on in France. But I'd never written a musical before. So I ended up writing it as a play and sent it to Stewart as a courtesy, thinking he wouldn't be interested. And he decided he was going to produce this play on Broadway.
Wow.
So we opened in DC. We got bad reviews. One of the producers, the co-producer, David Geffen, wanted to pull out and not bring us into New York. So Stewart had to abrogate his production agreement and mortgage his house to get us to the O'Neill. And that's how we got to Broadway. And it's one of those, Broadway stories. This one happens to have a happy ending, but it could easily have gone another way.
Wow. I know I was texting with BD Huang today about when the play opened. As you might remember, the audience was absolutely gobsmacked about how it ended, how theatrical it was, the gender reveal. Even when the play absolutely tells you from the beginning what happens, people were so naive and got sucked into the deception in a way that would be impossible now, probably. And then you had the opportunity to do it again a few years ago, and you went back and did some rewrites. I would love to hear about your experience, rewriting it, and then your experience then.
Yeah. So the original production of M. Butterfly turns a lot on the sort of gotcha, in a way, of, as you say, the audience believing that the Chinese spy Sung Li Ling is a woman for most of the show, and then all of a sudden, oh, it's a man. And in a way, it resembles, the sort of gotcha of the movie The Crying Game, which, by the way, was after M. Butterfly. And there's a whole story about the relationship between those two properties, which we probably shouldn't get into right now. But anyway,
Okay.
So when we revisited it in 2017 with the production that Julie Taymor directed, we wanted to go back into the script as well, because in a way, the original M. Butterfly is quite gender binary, because it turns on that, and it doesn't acknowledge, I think, or take into account the evolution of the way that we have come to learn about gender since 1988. And so the 2017 Broadway revival with Clive Owen and Jin Ha emphasized, had a more gender fluid approach to the story and to the character, and also tried to elevate the Chinese side of the story to have kind of equal narrative and theatrical weight with the Western side. And although it was not as successful and didn't run that long on Broadway, I still think that the new script is better, because I believe it speaks in a more specific and I think truthful way to how we look at gender today.
Yeah, it's interesting with that. And when the show opened in 1988, you were like catapulted into stardom, Tony Award, and I'm sure you were getting thousands of offers from anywhere. But I was reading an interview and you said you kind of felt you were pushed into the corner as just only writing Asian plays and being the person that only spoke to the Asian community and with Asian stories, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I actually feel that that particular crisis, which I've certainly had, was more a crisis in the mid 80s for me, like before M. Butterfly.
Okay.
That the early plays coming out of the public theater, I began to wonder, well, do I want to be labeled as an Asian American playwright? And yes, that is who I am, that is what I write about, and it's important to me, and is it limiting? And so that by the time I got to M. Butterfly, I was really, I found a story that enabled me to write from my perspective, from an Asian American lens, but also write non-Asian characters, which I hadn't really done in those early public theater days. So that after the success of M. Butterfly, I think, I was offered a lot of different things, generally because I'd proven I could write a good role for a white guy, which was in those days was what you had to prove you could do.
Yeah.
So you've worked in all kinds of medium, film, TV, opera. What's the difference writing for each of these mediums for you? And also, I guess, at some point in time, we want to talk about Flower Drum Song and then Soft Power and all of that good stuff. But what is it like for you being such a varied writer? What's the...
Yeah, so when my first plays got produced at the Public, I already back then was interested in working in film and television. I mean, not so much television in those days because, we hadn't entered the current period of peak television. And so it was just broadcast television, which isn't generally that interesting. But at that time, there's also the sense that, playwrights aren't supposed to do that, really, that it's either sort of selling out or you're going to kind of squander your gift or you're going to burn out or something like that. And then that never really made sense to me. So I've, been fortunate over the years to work in a lot of different forms because it's always seemed to me that why shouldn't you learn as much as you can and try to do as many things as you can in these careers and in a life. And the difference for me has a lot to do with two things. Number one, who holds the primary artistic voice in any particular form. So if I'm writing a play, I hold the primary voice. I'm the decider, if you will. And it's the other artist's job to kind of support my vision and try to bring my vision to life. But if I'm writing a movie, it ultimately becomes the director becomes the primary voice. If I'm writing a television show, it's the showrunner. If I'm writing an opera libretto, I think it's the composer. Not all opera librettists agree with me on this. The thing where it gets really complicated, though, is musicals. Because musicals are a form that don't necessarily have a single artistic voice. The book writer, the lyricist, the composer, the director, sometimes, particularly if you're doing corporate theater, the producer, everybody has to kind of do a mind meld and create one thing together. And I think that's why musicals are the hardest form, because you usually don't have one leader. The other thing that's different about the forms is how is the narrative, how is the story being told? So in a play, most of the information comes through the dialogue, and the visuals and acting and everything else support that. If it's a movie, most of the information comes visually. That's why movies were originally called pictures. That's why they were silent. And that's why the director is kind of the most important element. Television is a little bit in the middle. It tends to have been dialogue driven in the past, but has become much more visual lately. Opera is music. So, you know, that is an important issue also between the forms.
I'd love to ask, since we're talking about musicals now, about your experience with going into Flower Drum Song and redoing the book, and what the production was like and working on the musical.
Yeah, Flower Drum Song is a musical that a lot of people who are watching this will know. It was originally done in 1958. It was a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical based on a novel by C.Y. Lee, and it is the only show prior to 2016, prior to Allegiance. It is the only show in Broadway history to center around Asian American stories and characters, as opposed to like Asians in Asia. There are a number of those, but Asian Americans, Flower Drum Song is it. There's a couple of shows that are set in Hawaii, but other than that, it's Flower Drum Song. So by the time we get to the late 90s, Flower Drum Song was a hit in its time, but it's sort of fallen off the face of the earth. Like nobody's doing it anymore, whether it's because people feel it's offensive, or producers feel they can't cast it, which is never true, but okay, or simply because it's not, you know, it's not the greatest Hammerstein book from just a craftsmanship standpoint. He co-wrote it with Joseph Field, and he got sick in the middle of it. So it was never done. And I just felt it was sad that this property, this show, which holds this position in Broadway history, just didn't exist anymore. So I approached the Rodgers and Hammerstein estate, Ted Chapin, Mary Rogers, Jamie Hammerstein, and asked if I could redo the book, because this was a time when this whole notion of revisicals had started to become pretty prominent. And I figured, why can't we do a Flower Drum Song revisical? So they were super supportive. They gave me permission to do it. The problem then was that I, at that point, actually never written a musical. And so having gotten permission, and thinking, oh, how hard could this be? The songs already exist. But the composers aren't even around anymore. And then, of course, I learned, oh, it's actually much harder when the composers aren't around. Because as the musical director, David Chase, put it, you know, songs have their own DNA. And you can't, you know, especially when they're brilliant composers like R&H, and you can't screw with them that much. And so I was fortunate. R&H put me together with Robert Longbottom as the director, choreographer, with David Chase as the musical director. And they basically taught me how to write a musical. We worked in it for a few years, and opened up the initial production in 2001 out in LA at the Mark Taper Performance Center Theater Group, and was with Lea Salonga and Jose Lana. It was Telly Leung's first Broadway show.
Awesome.
It was a huge hit out there, and then we got to bring it to Broadway.
That's amazing. Well, now you've gotten to work with one of the greatest to do it, Janine Tesori. Talk about you know, so now you do get to work with living composers, and what a composer to be working with. Tell us the experience.
And a new musical.
And getting Grammy nominated. Like, come on, you're the coolest.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So, you know, I had this idea to do a reverse King and I, because I'd always loved The King and I. And I went to see the recent revival, the Bart Sher directed revival at Lincoln Center. And, it's pretty flawless as a production. And I was noticing, wow, there's some things that are kind of problematic about this show, like the premise, that you have a white woman who goes to Siam and teaches the king how to civilize his country and bring it into the family of nations. Like, that's not cool. And yet by the end of the musical, the king's dying, his son is taking over, and I'm like still crying, right? Because it's so well done and the music is so good. And so it's this very complicated feeling that I think a lot of us have when we revisit some of these older classic shows, books, movies, whatever, and we can appreciate certain aspects of it. And then certain stuff, just like the cringe factor, is pretty intense. And I began to think about, could I write like a reverse King and I? Because it suggests, my experience with the King and I suggests, okay, there's an ideological narrative embedded in a lot of these shows that we, didn't necessarily think of as political. And in this case, one could say this is a white supremacist narrative. And yet this is a term I learned from Janine eventually, the delivery system of the musical is so powerful that you listen to these things and the ideas just, you open up and the ideas come into you and you don't even know it. So, could I create something like that in reverse? And I decided to, could I write a story about a Chinese producer who comes to the States and becomes an advisory to what I initially thought, because I thought of this idea in like 2014, 2015, would become an advisor to President Hillary Clinton. But then I was like, for an idea like that to work, an ironic frame on a sincere R&H type musical, there's only one person who I have the hope of pulling this off, who is a great enough composer and also enough of a scholar of musical theater that there's a chance we could do this, and that's Janine Tesori. The day that Janine said that she was willing to come on the project, I sometimes grandiosely compared, and she always gives me a look when I say this, to, Churchill learning that the Americans were going to enter the World War II on their side. I was like, oh, wait, this is possible. And she's an amazing composer and being and inspiration, She and Lee Silverman, who I've worked with on many shows, she and Lee really pushed me to be rigorous, and particularly when I eventually incorporated my own stabbing into the show. Lee and Janine really pushed me to take that stabbing seriously, take my own character seriously, because it's easy for me to compartmentalize and kind of slough things off. So we are continuing to work on the show. We are doing a post-2020 version where we feel we don't have to relitigate, happily, we don't have to relitigate the 2016 election as much, but we want to look at, particularly in light of everything that's going on right now with anti-AAPI hate and attacks, we want to look at our place as AAPIs in this current crisis of American democracy. And we have commercial producers, No Guarantees, who have continued to be very supportive and believe in us. And we intend to come back to New York and fingers crossed Broadway.
All right.
I love that self-power is named after a concept that has dominated many disciplines in the recent years. What does the play tell us about the world we're living in today? Can you talk more about soft power and the concept of it?
So soft power is a term that was originally coined to describe a nation's influence on other countries as a sort of positive influence. It's when you get other countries to like you, like your narratives, believe in your people, believe in your philosophy. And soft power is something that America has had, in addition to hard power, which would be financial power, military power, for many decades, at least since World War II, less so lately. But, China has consciously tried to cultivate its soft power. This is something that was decided at a party congress several decades ago. And so part of that has been this push to create art and culture that will influence the world the same way that American movies and American musicals do. And by and large, I think it's fair to say that China, at least till now, hasn't been very successful. There isn't a Chinese international movie hit or a musical on our Broadway. And it's not just because it's an Asian country, because we have K-pop, we enjoy K-pop, we enjoy Bollywood, we enjoy Hong Kong crime thrillers. So I kind of wanted to investigate the question in soft power. Why is that? Is there something inherent about an art form needing to be created in an atmosphere of freedom, in order to be attractive to the rest of the world? Now, that's possible. It's also a very American point of view. So I don't know to what extent I'm influenced by my own lens, but it's one of the reasons I wanted to write the show, in order to investigate that question.
David, you've done all of the great things, Tony Award winner, Pulitzer Prize, all of these things. You've met the coolest people, but you wrote a song with Prince Rogers Nelson. And that's all we need to talk about right now. That's it. Please tell the story of being summoned. Prince, you wrote a song with Prince. That's all. That's the question.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite credits. I'm so glad we're going to talk about it. I've always been, I was a huge Prince fan. Probably when I was young, the two pop stars that meant the most to me were Prince and David Bowie. And so I had seen in People magazine that Prince went to see M. Butterfly in the original production. And I was like, how come nobody told me Prince was going to be at the theater? But this was a time when Prince was interested in creating a Broadway show. Mm-hmm. And again, it shows how ahead of his time he always was, because nowadays, of course, every baby boomer pop star wants to do a Broadway show. But back then, it was still considered this weird thing that pop stars generally didn't write for Broadway. And so I'm sure he interviewed, as a matter of fact, I know a couple of other theater artists that he met with, but I was also somebody that he met with. And back then, I mean, this is the early 90s. So he was pretty much at the height of his success, and you kind of had to wait a few days for Prince to call. Every day there would be a call from Paisley Park, Prince might call today. So you kind of wait by your phone, and then the day goes by, he doesn't call.
No call.
So eventually, he did, and I was like, "Oh, I'm such a big fan, and I'm so thrilled to get to talk to you, and it's great that you want to do some sort of show, and I'd love to." Blah. And then I stopped talking, and it's silence on the other end of the phone. So I'm like, and I understand you. I just keep talking, and then finally he talks. And so we met in a hotel. I can't remember what it's called now, but it's on 55th Street. And he had a whole floor, maybe at least one floor. And I'm told to go to a particular room. I knock on the door, and he opens the door, and he's in Prince drag. I mean, he's wearing the heels. He's got the purple thing on. It's like really Prince. And once we sat down together and started talking, it was kind of like working with somebody else. I mean, he was down to earth. And one of the things he said to me, he had an idea for a show, but he also said, "Oh, I want to write a song with a spoken word section in the middle. And maybe you could write the spoken word part." So I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. Yeah. So he told me what he wanted to be about. And I, wrote some blank verse thing and go back to LA. And two days later, like FedEx, there's a cassette, and he'd written this song. He didn't end up having a spoken word thing, but he'd kind of incorporated what I'd written into this song solo.
Into the lyrics.
Yeah. And and I was like, great, this is the best piece of fan memorabilia anybody could ever have. And the show that we talked about didn't end up happening. But a year later, the phone rings, and it's Paisley Park. And they're like, oh, the song you wrote with Prince is going to be the B-side of the single. And, we didn't have any agreement or anything. Like, he could have just run off and did it himself and never credited me, but he did. And now I have a gold record on my wall, which is actually the best piece of fan memorabilia anyone could have.
That's so cool.
That's incredible. David, tell me how Chinese opera influences your work.
So I didn't grow up going to theater. I also didn't grow up really going to Chinese opera much. I think I maybe went to a Chinese opera performance once when I was visiting my grandparents in Taiwan. But my first play, FOB, was largely a comedy that was set in Los Angeles, but also incorporated characters from traditional Chinese mythology. And when Mako decided to direct the original production, or when Mako was asked to direct the original production at the Public Theater, he brought in a young actor named John Lone. And John went on to star in the title role in Bertolucci's Oscar-winning film, The Last Emperor. So people might remember him nowadays from that. He went on to have quite a big career. But he was starting out in the theater and had grown up doing Cantonese opera in Hong Kong. So he had those chops, and we made that movement part of FOB. So I began to learn about it. Then I wrote a second play called The Dance and the Railroad for John and another actor who is a dancer named Tai Ma. And Tai has also gone on to have a big career. He's the dad in a lot of stories for their Chinese people, particularly most recently in The Farewell, the Lulu Wang movie. Mm-hmm. So I kind of learned on the job, and it was a way to try to create not only Chinese American stories or content, but try to create some sort of theatrical form that I felt would represent both of these cultures, and incorporating Chinese opera into essentially a Western play framework felt like one way to get at challenging the form.
Oh, wow. So it's a way, so it's like a starting place.
It's a way to try to have the form reflect the content.
Go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. I'm just like, I'm conscious of the time. And, you had written this question about, if there's something that you could change about the theater, right now, it feels like we really are in a reckoning, what is one thing, you think that you would want to change to better the experience of the theater in general? I mean, I feel like it takes all of us, but the BIPOC community really, we're stepping up in a way that is thrilling. And what's the hope? What's one change that you would like to see?
Wow, it's so hard to figure out like one.
Oh, yeah.
You can pick two.
Okay. Because when we're talking about things that are systemic, by definition, we're talking about a system. And so, yes, you can say, oh, I want to change the system, but that's too general. But then when you get into specifics, that's, you feel like, oh, any one thing doesn't really make that big a change. What I feel is, so I'm going to try to land in the middle someplace and say, what I think is really important is to create a theater where all people feel welcome. And I think that that welcoming can imply a lot of things. It's not only how we reach out. It's not only the stories we tell. It's not only having diverse bodies on stage. It's not only having diversity in leadership. It encompasses all those things, and that's when you get into the fact that this is systemic. But if I had to name one thing, all of those systemic changes are to create a theater where everybody feels welcome and represented.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I loved hearing you talk about going to see The King and I and being moved by it. And, like a week after you get stabbed, you're at the theater seeing Allegiance. So, and you have so many fans, right? Like, I mean, so I guess the question is, what are you a fan of? What gets David excited about going to the theater, and like what are you eager and excited to see when you go?
I think one of the ways in which I'm blessed as a theater artist who's gotten to have a career for several decades is that I still feel like an audience member when I go to the theater. I'm still excited. It's not like I watch things and I try to pick them apart. And I like a lot of things and I'm excited. So I love the experience of going to theater. That's still why I do what I do. And yes, nowadays, particularly well, this has always been the case, but when I see I get to experience a new voice particularly from a community that hasn't been represented well or at all on our stages, that makes me feel like the form is still alive. It's still vital. It's still changing. It's adapting. And because I love theater, that longevity, the promise of longevity, gets me really excited.
What's your hope for when we get out of this? We're still in the midst of this pandemic, and hopefully the theater is going to start opening in the fall. But what is your hope for when we get out of this?
Yeah, I hope we can reinvestigate and our practices and the way that we make theater to be more humane, to be more inclusive. There's all this stuff that's just been kind of handed down that we took for granted because those of us who are lucky enough to be working are so busy that we're just kind of on the treadmill, right? And we never had a chance to step back and go, wait, why are we doing it that way? And hopefully, I know that is what a lot of us have been doing during this time. And now is the moment to begin to implement things that we've learned and say, just because that's how it was done since 1965 is not the reason that it needs to exist this way going forward.
And find a way to disassemble and build it back up.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and John as well. We're huge fans.
You're the coolest.
You are great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for the Prince story. John and I will take that to our grave for the rest of our life.
Yeah, and I want to put John Andrews, "You're the coolest," on like a bumper sticker or something. I just like make a little pin, and I'll just wear it. It's so great.
We'll get that to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much.
That is our show. Thank you, David, for sharing all those amazing stories with us. And to our audience, this hour just flew by. Thank you, my beautiful friend, John Andrew, for hosting with me tonight. Our second season is quickly coming to an end, and very upsetting. Next Monday, May 17th, Joy and I will talk with the magnificent Ann James. Regular listeners have heard Ann co-hosting with me, and next Monday, we will spend some time learning about this fascinating woman. Ann is a theater educator, stage director, and an intimacy choreographer. And she is devoted to making both stage and screen safer places for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to practice their craft. And for our last show of the season, John, Andrew, and I will be talking with the talented Robin Herder. Robin was nominated for a Tony for her performance as Nini in Moulin Rouge, the musical. But did you know that she also played Lena in Play It Cool at the Acorn back in 2011? I bet you didn't know that. We will talk about her entire career on May 24th at 7 p.m. We hope you enjoyed our show. If you did, please take a moment and press the like button and subscribe. For news about upcoming guests, check out our website, liveatthelortel.com. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. We will see you next Monday at 7 p.m. Stay healthy, wear a mask, and get the vaccine. Yes. Thank you for joining us. And again, thank you, David, from the bottom of our heart.
Yes.
You're an idol, and I'm so glad to meet you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Be safe, everybody. We'll see you really soon.